I think this is an appropriate moment to try and summarize some of the basic concepts behind the course, and actually very much leading on from what Miroslav and Doug have just been saying. And this starts with a claim, which is that to understand the modern world, you have to be faith literate. You have to understand the role of faith. And it is built on what I'm going to call facts, or certain, I would say, clear and distinguishable elements of reality about the modern world. Globalization is growing as a phenomenon, and it is driven by people, and it is constantly pushing the world together. There is nowhere I travel extensively. There is nowhere I go in the world today where it is not obvious that the impact of globalization is changing not merely the economies but the societies of those countries. The other thing which, until a few years ago, would have been a fact that people would have questioned is that faith is not diminishing, it is in fact growing. Now, it is not growing everywhere, and you could argue that in Europe and in some parts of the West it is diminishing, somewhat at least. But it is nonetheless growing worldwide, and not simply within the religion of Islam. Christianity is a growing phenomenon in China, for example. What comes out of these facts are then other realities. The interaction between people is of a different nature as a result of globalization pushing people together. Now, what Miroslav was talking about, well, the encounter between two is really between four, it's really between six, which I was a trifle confused about to begin with, but then you explained it and I understand exactly what you mean. Actually, it's a very important point, because if you're with somebody who's from the same village and you're of the same faith and the same color and the same ethnic background, there are a whole series of things that you assume that you don't have to find out about. It's very natural to you. You put in a whole lot of difference and diversity, that is then a different type of encounter, and an encounter obviously with more dimension. So that interaction between people through globalization, through interaction between people of different faiths and cultures, is qualitatively really far more profound to understand and to cope with than in previous times. It is also correct that people's faith can be, as we said right at the beginning, it can be a source of identity, and is a source of identity for sure. It can be a source of identity in opposition, in contradiction to others. It can therefore result in faith giving rise to conflict, which it does, and as we saw, the role of religion is dominant in probably a majority of conflicts now in the world. But also, faith can give rise to good works. That is plainly true as well. At the same time, there are differences between faiths, and there are also, as Doug was just saying, there is some point at which there seems to be a rapprochement of values between the different faiths. We're just dealing with facts now. These are the things that go to make up this sort of the matrix of what I would call the matrix of realities around this issue to do with faith and globalization. There are also, this is another thing that is happening in the world at the moment, there are debates within each faith. Right? So one of the things that is really mistaken is to talk about a faith as if there is a certain dominant view within that faith of how it sees the world. Actually, you look at any major faith today, There is plainly a traditional and a modernizing tendency. There is a reaching out tendency and a reaching in tendency. This is true within virtually all faiths. And if you take debates over gender, just take debates over gay rights, you can have people of the same faith reaching diametrically different conclusions on these issues. But faith will be the prism within which many of these issues are discussed and debated. Here's something else that I think is important, is that faith communities themselves are also evolving. Now, they're evolving often in different directions, and you can get even contradictory directions, but that is also happening. So my sort of starting point is you need to be faith literate. Why? Because globalization is growing, pushing people together. The world of faith is growing. The interplay between people then becomes more important. Faith can be a force for good. It can be a force for bad. There are clearly common areas between faiths. There are major differences. But also, there is this evolution within the faith community where there are differences between people as to what they think, even within the same faith, intra-faith, and the faith communities themselves are evolving. So what this means, in my view, and one of the things, because all the way through what I'm trying to think of is what are the practical consequences for policy, for thought as a result of this. What is obvious is this relationship between the world of faith and the world of globalization is an important part of understanding the modern world, and having a relationship that is positive between those two is an important part of making the modern world work. Now, one of the practical consequences out of this, I think, is that we need to develop actually a far greater understanding of how these different forces are developing. This is not a religious question. You know, one of the reasons why this course is a collaboration between the School of Management and the School of Divinity is precisely because we recognize this is not just a religious question. It has major social, economic, and political consequences. So the question that we then ask arising out of this is, okay, so how do we make this world work? And I want to suggest that the following is essential if we want to make it work. Here are 5 points I make briefly. The first is we need knowledge. We need to have knowledge. Knowledge is essential. Knowledge is good in itself. An explanation, knowing, being able to understand the other person. This is a central part of it. So one major aspect of what we've got to do is to make sure that people have the ability and capacity and opportunity to learn. Ignorance to fear to conflict is one very obvious train of happenstance. Understanding, acceptance, peace is another. So the fact that you know about the other person, the fact that you understand where they come from, the fact that you have some concept in your mind of their cultural background doesn't mean to say you get on, but it's obviously a help, and I would say that knowledge is essential. It's essential at the level of leaders and nations, which is why things like this concept that Turkey and Spain launched about the alliance of civilizations, which is very much obviously a sort of counterpoint to the Huntington thesis. It's important at that level. It is important at the level of action, and I agree with what Doug is saying, and actually the discussion with Rick about hand to heart to head came out of discussions we had with Rick and with others, which is that if you start with action, then you're more likely to get people to interact together without a lot of complicating theological questions where you immediately highlight the differences between people. So, for example, one part of what we do in the foundation is to try and get people to work together on the anti-malaria campaign. Right? However, and this may seem strange for me since I come from the world of the sort of, it's supposed to be the world of practice in politics, and you guys come from the world of academia. I also think, though, that education, not just in the terms of the exchange of information, but in the academic sense, is an important part of this. I think we need to understand some of the phenomena that are working here. I think we have to have a far greater ability both in research, empirical evidence and data to try and work out what are these different strands that are going on within the world today. And so when I say my first point is knowledge is essential, I think there's a massive amount that we've still got to accomplish in trying to make that knowledge as deep and as deep and as comprehensive as it needs to be. The second thing, so that's the first thing. How do we make this world of faith and globalization work? Knowledge. The second is this. You do need to acknowledge in any society, if you're going to have a society where there's harmony between faiths, there's got to be some common space and some common rules of engagement. And this is, in a sense, what we were talking with Nick last week about. You have to accept that different faiths have an equal right to speak. You have to accept that actually the secular world and the faith world also have equal rights to speak. You have to have some rules of engagement for this. I think you need, as we were saying last week, you need some civility in the nature of the debate. And you also need countries and societies that are of different faiths and different cultures. They've got to have some common space where people congregate and are prepared to say, this is what we share in common, and this is an important part also of our identity. We don't give up our faith identity, but just as in America when the flag is there, people rise to salute the flag, and that is what you do, whatever your faith, whatever your color, whatever your background, that is a unifying force. Actually, this is something that is can be seen as patriotism, and of course it is, but actually there's something else that's really important about it. It's an indication that at this point and in this space, everyone comes together. And I think that's a critical part. I think it's a critical part of the rules of engagement for a multi-faith society. But I think you need that common space and you need those common rules of engagement. I think thirdly, that in practice, what this then means is an attitude that is what I would call open rather than closed. And that what's more, it should be a goal of public policy to encourage or facilitate that openness. There's an interesting side consequence of this, which is it actually has an impact on globalization as well, on your economic policy. Because it's very hard to have a society that is open in terms of faith, in terms of culture, in terms of background, if it's closed economically. So there is a link, in fact, between the idea that in the modern world, human capital is essential, that human capital should be on the basis of the equal dignity of each human being, and actually a successful economy where people are recognizing that they live in a world in which there's going to be trade between nations, exchange of intellectual, human, and financial capital. And actually, one of the reasons why protectionism, in my view, is not a good response to today's world is partly because if you take that closed economic attitude, it actually becomes quite hard to have an open attitude to people of different faiths and backgrounds within society. So in practice, it requires an open and not a closed attitude. That should be a goal of public policy. And here's one other thing which I think is really important, is that if you have that open attitude, then I think it doesn't really work unless it comes on the basis of that openness being there available for all and not simply for a few. So there is something universal about that for it to work. Now, fourthly, even if you believe you have an exclusive truth, faith truth, you've still got to be then supportive of an inclusive society. This is a point that Miroslav has often made, and I think it's worth just spending a moment on, which is that what he says in essence, as I understand it, is this, that, look, if you have a faith, and let's say you're a Christian, you believe in salvation through Jesus Christ, you cannot at a certain point, I mean, that is what you believe is the truth. Right? You cannot at a certain point say, well, but I think you who don't believe that have equal validity, because, I mean, obviously that's the whole essence of your belief. Right? And so Miroslav, I think, has drawn a distinction between, as it were, exclusivity in terms of this is my truth, my faith truth that I believe in, and then using that as exclusivity in terms of shutting out the other person, right? And I think that is true, but I also think something else that is interesting about the way globalization interplays with faith is that as that knowledge deepens, and as you learn to inhabit freely that common space, and as that produces what I would say is a kind of more open attitude, I think faith also evolves in that process. So that yes, you still believe in your own faith, but your openness to someone of another faith is more than just accepting that they have that faith and that they believe it's valid. You also start to accept their spiritual sincerity, right? Even if you don't necessarily accept their truth claim. And that's quite important. And you were quoting St. Paul earlier, but of course, the extraordinary thing about the early Christian church was St. Paul going out and saying, this is a message that I have for Greek as well as Jew, that this is, as it were, a message that is universal and not simply restricted to the Jewish people. When you come to Islam, the whole point about what the Prophet was saying, in a way, was to say you actually have to push it even broader than up to then either the Jewish faith or the Christian faith had acknowledged. My point is simply this, that the fourth thing that I think you require for this world of faith and globalization to work is that at the least you even if you believe you have the exclusive truth, you've got to want an inclusive society. But I also think that you need to accept that there is a level of respect that you have for the person of a different faith that is more than simply accepting as a fact that they have a different faith, but you also accept the sincerity with which they hold that faith, and that some good can come out of it. In other words, when I engage with somebody of a different faith who's engaged with us in our projects, for example, in Africa on the anti-malaria campaign, and we work with primarily actually with Jews and Muslims as well as Christians, although actually there are Hindus involved in it as well. But when I see what difference, let's say, somebody of the Jewish faith, what difference their faith makes to them and their actions, it's more than, for me, simply, well, I accept they happen to feel very strongly, and I'm prepared to accept that reality. I'm actually accepting something more than that. I'm accepting that there is a sincerity about their view and a motivation as a result of that for them to do good that sits alongside, if you like, the issue to do with who is right and wrong in a faith sense, but sits alongside it quite powerfully. You know what I mean? So it's a, and this is what I think is fascinating about the way the world then develops, because yes, you keep your own religious faith and you keep that strongly, but your very openness to the other and you're working alongside them and your understanding of why it is that they are as they are also changes your own sense of what faith is about. It doesn't change your own belief, but it does let you acknowledge someone of a different belief, I think in a far more profound way than simply accepting as a matter of fact they've got a different faith. And that's where you move, I think, from tolerance to respect, which is a very, very important part of the journey. And the final thing is this. And here is where I think the debate is in the sense that at its most interesting, because we've really discussed this very often, for obvious reasons, in the context of what, in an era of globalization, how do you make religious faith end up as a source of coexistence and not conflict? So we've really looked at the issue of faith more in terms of is it a force for good or ill in faith terms or in social terms? Right. There's something else, though, that is really interesting, which is that globalization is a force, but if it is to be welcomed, it needs, for the benefits of that globalization to be shared, for the opportunities not to be restricted, and globalization without values governing it and underpinning it, globalization is less likely to be accepted, less likely to be successful, and actually less likely to work, because if it's not accepted and it's not successful, globalization itself can become a force that can produce conflict or ill. And that's why, therefore, what is interesting about the role of faith and why people thought maybe you'd squeeze faith out of society as economic prosperity advanced. Why hasn't it happened in the end? It hasn't happened because of something very deep within people that says, I understand the benefits of globalization, I desire the material prosperity that may come with it, but I know that in and of itself there has to be something more in order to make life worth living. Right? And what is more, that as this globalization, which is in some ways an impersonal force, changes and disrupts people's lives, so there is a desire to reassert some sense of values, some sense of shaping this process of globalization to ends that we consider compatible with progress in humanity. So I think the interesting thing in the end, as Miroslav was saying earlier, and Doug was remarking about the point at which people of religious faith come to a certain common understanding. The question that faith does ask about globalization, and that should be asked, you don't have to be a person of faith to ask it, incidentally, but it is the question that faith asks of globalization: as to what purpose? You know, what is the end? You know, what are we trying to achieve here? And without that, in my view, globalization is a poorer and possibly even more dangerous phenomenon. So that's my view of why this matters and what we need to do to make it work. And the conclusion, actually, that you come to overall from this is the relationship between faith and globalization is fundamentally important, and in order for it to work, the world of faith has got something to say about this process. Not merely from the point of view of how we avoid conflict between people of different faiths, but actually from the point of view of how you make this process of globalization humane and progressive and working for the benefit of all humankind.